A young Cuban walked into Sugar Ray Robinson's nightclub in Harlem. Sugar Ray himself was tending bar as the Cuban ordered 2 shots of whiskey. He said, "This one is for me, and that one's for you." "No," Robinson replied. "I don't drink. I'm the welterweight champion of the world." "Not until you've beaten me, you're not," the Cuban replied. "My name is..." Kid Gavilan was born Gerardo Maras on January 6, 1926, on a small sugar plantation in the Cuban province of Camagüey. But his father would abandon the family shortly after his birth. His mother would remarry, and Gerardo would take his stepfather's last name of Gonzalez. Poverty forced Gerardo to leave school at the age of 12, and he found work in the sugarcane fields of Camagüey. From the age of 12 to 15, the young man wielded a 7-pound bolo knife, cutting through the sugarcane fields, building his cardio and muscles. An amateur boxing gym would open in his town during this time, and the 75-pound Gerardo took to the sport immediately. He would win numerous amateur championships, and by the age of 17, he would move to Havana for a career in professional boxing. He signed with a manager named Francisco Bolido, who renamed him Kid Gavilan for the express purpose of promoting his cafe, which was called El Gavilan, Spanish for the Hawk. Turning pro as a featherweight at the age of 17, Gavilan compiled a record of 25-2 before heading to New York for what he called the big time. Upon his arrival on the American boxing scene, a nightclub owner named Angel Lopez took over the managerial reins of his career. Fighting on the East Coast, Gavilan was an instant hit with fans and boxing writers alike. Ring magazine described him as, quote, "a fighter with the speed of a racer, a loose style punctuated with hooks, bolos, shuffles, and power. His nimbleness often resembled a rumba." Fans also took notice of his bolo punch, a hybrid hook uppercut that Gavilan delivered with an exaggerated windup. Gavilan claimed that he developed the punch after working in the cane fields, using the same motion that he would use in cutting down the stalks. He would then bounce between fighting in Havana and the East Coast, going on a hot streak of wins, but then inexplicably losing to non-entities like Doug Radford, among others. Critics attributed his hot and cold nature to his love of the nightlife, which prevented him from fighting the full 3 minutes of every round. Gavilan had developed a bad habit of taking it easy in the early portion of the round, but then coming on in the last minute. This impressed the crowd, but not the judges, who would see him look at the overhead clock above before dialing it up a notch. Gavilan himself would insist that his tendency to fight only in spurts was not due to his lack of conditioning, but that the losses during the early portion of his career were because of his inexperience. The criticism and losses seemed to inspire Gavilan, and in 1948 he went on a 4-fight tear, defeating difficult but under-the-radar fighters like Tommy Bell, Rocco Rosano, Roman Alvarez, and Buster Tyler. Fans jumped on his bandwagon. He earned a fight against welterweight champion Sugar Ray Robinson, although it was an over-the-weight non-title match. Robinson came into the fight with an 87-1-1 record. But fans anticipating a slugfest were disappointed, as the fight was a dull affair. Neither fighter inflicted any damage, but Robinson was only slightly busier and got the win. Working to win back the trust of his fans, Gavilan would go on a 6-fight win streak against good opposition, which included 2 decision victories over lightweight champion Ike Williams. Gavilan regained his top contender status and was awarded a rematch with Sugar Ray Robinson in July of 1949 for the welterweight title. The fight went the 15-round distance, and it was close, but once again, Robinson won a decision. Ring magazine reported that Robinson looked as if he were afraid to take any chances after suffering a cut, but he pulled away on points in the late rounds as he had more left in the tank than Gavilan. Gavilan then regressed back to giving hot and cold performances, losing decisions to Billy Graham, Robert Villamain, George Costner, Gene Hairston, but defeating other notables such as Bo Jack, Tony Gennaro, Joe Michelli, Tommy Ciarlo, and gaining revenge over both Graham and Hairston in rematches. The victories earned him a shot at the vacant welterweight title when Robinson moved up to the middleweight division. In May of 1951, Gavilan would batter Johnny Bratton for 15 rounds and become the welterweight champion of the world. But in his first defense, Gavilan would receive what critics described as a gift decision over Billy Graham. This fueled speculation among sports writers that Gavilan's good fortune may have been controlled by the mob. Critics also noticed that Gavilan was slipping. He threw his flashy combinations with decreasing frequency, and his speed was diminishing. After Gavilan struggled against a 4-1 underdog in Bobby Dykes, most believed it was only a matter of time before someone dethroned the Hawk. That someone was determined to be a 31-0 slugger named Gil Turner. Gavilan was coerced to defend his welterweight title against Turner in Turner's hometown of Philadelphia, and many writers picked the challenger to end Gavilan's reign. The fight drew a gate of over $269,000, which set a record for welterweights at that time, and the fight itself would be a battle for the ages. Gavilan seemed to get new life after the win, picking up 3 wins in Argentina before decisively beating nemesis Billy Graham over 15 rounds. Gavilan would then defend his title against the 37-0 Chuck Davey. Davey was massively popular, but despite the glossy record, Gavilan saw the southpaw Davey as a novice, and during the bout, he occasionally switched to fighting in a southpaw stance himself to mock what he thought was an undeserving foe. The fight was so one-sided that viewers thought Gavilan was carrying his opponent for the sake of the television broadcast, and one writer called Gavilan the greatest carrier since Typhoid Mary. Despite being called out by critics, Gavilan had the respect of his peers. After the fight, Joe Louis called him the best in the business. Rocky Marciano said Gavilan was in a class by himself. But he remained consistently inconsistent, as 3 months later Gavilan would lose to the unknown but dangerous Danny Womber in a non-title fight. Womber used Gavilan's own strategy against him, closing fast near the end of the round to steal the judge's eye. Gavilan would follow this up with a split-decision title defense win over Carmen Basilio, who knocked Gavilan down for only the 2nd time in his career. Gavilan managed to outwork Basilio the rest of the way, but his manager, Angel Lopez, thought Gavilan's best days were behind him. The Hawk began experiencing trouble making the welterweight limit, and after beating up Johnny Bratton again for 15 rounds, Gavilan would step up in weight to challenge Bobo Olsen for the middleweight title, and he would lose a close decision. Insiders believed that Angel Lopez wanted to cash out on Gavilan, and they would prove to be right, as 6 months later, Gavilan would lose his welterweight title against Johnny Saxton in a boring fight over 15 rounds. Gavilan's manager Angel Lopez made a private deal with Johnny Saxton's manager and known gangster Blinky Palermo, where Angel would get $40,000 up front if Gavilan put his welterweight title up for grabs. Gavilan would become enraged at Lopez after the bout, knowing that he had clearly outpointed Saxton and that the judges had been bought. Lopez insisted that Gavilan would get a return bout, but they were empty promises. No rematch would ever take place. Still, one writer described the boring fight as how Saxton wouldn't and Gavilan couldn't, as it was clear that Gavilan was no longer the fighter he once was. His wife Leonore would divorce him shortly after the loss, suing for alimony and support for their children. Gavilan would campaign for another 3 years, but lose more than he would win, even to fighters that he had defeated years earlier with ease. Gavilan would finally retire after being shut out by Yama Bahama over 10 rounds in 1958. His final boxing record was 108 wins against 30 losses and 5 draws, and remarkably, he would never be stopped in any of those 30 losses. Upon his retirement from boxing, Gavilan would move back to Cuba, having earned over $3.8 million in the ring. But Fidel Castro assumed power shortly thereafter, and Gavilan, now a Jehovah's Witness, was arrested numerous times after preaching in the streets, given the official charge of conspiring against the Castro regime. Gavilan was then conscripted to be a farm laborer, but he got an exemption because of his chronic low back pain and his cataracts. Gavilan said, quote, "I had money in the bank, owned 5 properties, and had 3 insurance policies until Castro took over and took all of my money and property away from me. I lost everything. I had to begin a new life." Surviving 8 miserable years in Cuba, Gavilan would return to the United States in 1966 with 2 empty pockets. He would find work cleaning a public park in Tampa for $100 a week, but his vision continued to worsen. He would move to Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and despite being nearly blind, he would find work as a security guard. He would eventually move back to Florida and end his working life by selling sausages. In public, Gavilan would always be gracious to fans who complimented him on his boxing career, and he would always ask them the same question. Wasn't I something? Kid Gavilan would spend the last 8 years of his life at an assisted living facility in Hialeah, Florida. Blind and suffering from dementia, he was estranged from his family and died penniless in 2003. One of the greatest fighters of all time was to be buried in a pauper's grave marked by a 10-inch bronze plaque. But in 2005, a group of boxing elite, headed by Ray Mancini and Mike Tyson, raised money to have Gavilan's remains exhumed and placed in another part of the cemetery, where he received a dignified and proper burial. The bottom of his headstone now reads, Kid Gavilan, welterweight champion.